Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Father-Son Packers podcast, your source for Packers news, notes, and analysis. My name is Tommy. I am here, one of your hosts, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, my dad, Matt. Dad, how are you doing?
Doing well. Recording again on the road as we've driven through Yosemite Park through Tioga Pass, first time in the Eastern Sierras. Beautiful day. Watched some fall colors in California.
Pretty rare for California. If you don't know, if you're not from around here, we don't really get seasons. It's just kind of just a one big gradient. It gets a little colder in the winter, gets hotter in the summer, but we really don't get much fall. We get a little bit of spring, but no fall really whatsoever to speak of. But Dad, speaking of falls, the Packers have kind of started to tail off a little bit over the last couple of weeks. I just saw the segue and I had to take it. But we are here today to talk a little bit about, do a little bit of a post-bye week special edition to talk a little bit about how the Packers are doing through 5 games in 6 weeks. We're going to look at what the statistics say, what a lot of the metrics are saying, what we feel like we're seeing out there on the field, et cetera, et cetera. Don't worry, though. We will still be doing a pregame later this week for the Packers matchup against the Broncos, one that we really hope they're going to win. But don't worry, this is not in lieu of that. This is just kind of a special post-bye week episode. But yeah, Dad, we're going to talk all about all that stuff. But before we do, just wanted to pitch a couple of things. If you like what you hear here today, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. We tweet out when we have new episodes out, articles we find interesting, pieces of Packers news, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, come give us a follow there. And if you like what you hear even more, come subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice, whether that's Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We even put all our episodes out on YouTube as well. So if you want to check that out, come check that out. We would really appreciate it. It would really help our numbers. But Dad, a lot of stuff going on in Packers. Early bye this year, week 6, earlier than usual. 5 games played. Packers are 2-3. Lots to talk about there. But maybe before we get into that, we could touch on a little bit of news and notes from Titletown. So today, a few roster moves made by the Packers as they signed running back James Robinson to the practice squad, who was formerly of the Jaguars and the Jets and was previously on the Patriots roster this offseason. He had a very good rookie year in 2020, but has since dealt with injuries and has struggled to kind of get back to that same form. And they have also signed cornerback Anthony Johnson to the practice squad. And no, you are not seeing double. Don't need to check your prescription. They now have 2 Anthony Johnsons on the roster. They have 1 on the roster and 1 on the practice squad. This one is also a rookie, also a defensive back. But yeah, so they've added that. And then the corresponding move was to cut Keandre Thomas off of the practice squad. Dad, I think my main note here on these moves is that I was a bit surprised that Patrick Taylor was not re-signed to the practice squad. Now, yes, he was out of practice squad elevations, so they could not bring him up to the active roster from the practice squad for game day. But they had just signed him to the active roster for that matchup against the Raiders and then cut him and re-signed Justin Hollins. But it seems that they had really liked Taylor and had kept him around for a few years. He was one of their core special teamers. He was their go-to quick game running back in the 2-minute drill against the Saints when they won that game. And I'm just surprised that they didn't at least keep him around on the practice squad, around the team, in case they needed to sign him later in the year to the active roster in case of injury or something like that. What did you think about these moves, about not bringing back Patrick Taylor, who apparently worked out for the Patriots today, about cutting Keandre Thomas? Anything there that really stood out to you, or any comments on any of that? What do you think?
So I'd say the most surprising thing about the Patrick Taylor issue is that he did seem to be, with Jones out, their go-to back, their running back of choice for the hurry-up offense. Not Dillon. That was Taylor who was in all those situations. So that's a little bit surprising. Does it mean maybe Jones is healthier? I don't know. I could speculate on all kinds of crazy, optimistic notions if I wanted to. The other thing about, so they've got one rookie cornerback from UVA, Anthony Johnson, and another rookie defensive back safety, Anthony Johnson Jr. So can UVA Anthony Johnson claim that he's Anthony Johnson Jr.'s daddy?
I don't know, but I don't think he's senior, so technically no. But I think we might just need to have to start including the junior on the end for any time we're referring to them. Or maybe hopefully not. Yeah, AJJ and AJ. Yes, although it's going to get annoying, I'm sure.
If they're both in the game, it's going to be very, confusing to
very
all the
bothersome.
announcers.
Yes, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot about it if they ever both end up in the game. But yeah, so that's kind of the main news and notes around the Packers right now. We'll be having an injury update on the roster during the pregame for the game against the Broncos, so we'll save that for then. But Dad, should we get into this post-bye week analysis and talk a little bit about how the Packers have been looking this year? We know everyone who's listened to this has watched all the games, but maybe you're not familiar with, what the numbers are saying. I think sometimes when I watch games, I can get emotional about, oh man, the running game is horrible. Okay, spoiler alert, the running game is not very good, but
yeah,
it's things like that.
That's not just emotion.
The stats
There's
do
a lot
bear
of
out.
hard, cold facts about the running game not being good and don't have any need to bring emotion to. It's because those hard and cold facts are so bad that the emotions start bubbling to the surface.
But yes, a lot to talk about here, Dad. Let's start with the offense. Let's talk a little bit about how the Packers offense has looked so far this year. And I know we have a bunch of notes written out, but I'm just gonna pop a question on you. You have not prepped for this at all. I'm sorry about this, but
you mean all the prep I did wasn't good enough? I still need a pop quiz.
Well, if you had to express your feelings about the offense through 5 games, what are your feelings generally around the offense as a whole? Not necessarily specifically the pass game, not necessarily specifically the running game. How do you feel about the offense just watching it before we go into the stats, maybe underlying about how they're actually performing?
3 words: not good enough. And I guess the thing that's the biggest disappointment so far is that after like the first game or two, their offensive line is underperforming.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair to say.
That's the most worrisome thing about the sort of the holistic view of the offense, is that there's a hope that the offensive line would be stronger this year, be more settled. Jenkins would be further out from his injury. Bakhtiari would be more stable after playing 2/3 of the games last year. And that we'd actually, one way the offense could still do well is that the offensive line would be good. And that seems to be getting further away with every passing week.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And we'll talk a little bit about the offensive line in depth in a second. For me, I think my thought actually is it's kind of expected, when you look at it as a whole, but I don't like the direction that it's going. I don't like that it feels like the offense is getting worse every week. I think they had their best day on offense. You could argue between the Atlanta game and the Bears game, in my opinion. I actually thought they looked better against Atlanta than they did against the Bears, but they put up better numbers against the Bears. So you could argue the Bears, they played better against the Bears. They had a good game against Atlanta. Then they had terrible first half against the Saints and managed to pull out a miracle victory.
Pretty much 3 quarters against the Saints.
Pretty much since the fourth quarter of that Atlanta game when they fell apart, they have really struggled to do much of anything with the football. I mean, most of that Saints game, terrible. The whole Lions game, pretty much terrible. I know they made like a fake comeback at the end, and no comebacks to me like ever really a fake comeback, because they did get to like almost one. They had a chance to get it to 1 score, which I know sounds really sad when you say it like that. And then the Raiders game. I mean, you're just kind of putzing around against a really not very impressive defense.
That was a competition of ineptitude, that game against the Raiders.
Yeah. Man, those poor folks that had to have that as their primetime. I don't know why that game's on Monday Night Football, but I just don't like the direction that the offense is going, I think, is how I feel about it. But now that we have our
that's fair. There's been this general sense that they're getting worse as the season goes on.
Yeah, and that's the feeling.
There are a few things that I think bear that out too, in a few different position groups.
Hopefully, after the bye week, they're able to clean up a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff to clean up, so I don't think the bye week's going to magically fix everything. Hopefully, I guess I should say they can clean up enough stuff that they can get back on track. But Dad, let's start talking about the offense in earnest and talk a little bit about how they stand relative to the rest of the league. And we'll start by going overall. So these are some numbers. they actually pretty much bear out that the Packers are more of a middle-of-the-pack offense, which I think that's why I kind of said it's to be expected, because we kind of expected them to be a bit of a middle-of-the-pack team. I think the concern comes with the direction that they're going, but I digress. So, here are some numbers. Do with them as you will. The Packers currently are 16th in team offense DVOA per FTN. They are 13th in EPA per play and 18th in success rate per RBSDM.com. They are 6th in red zone touchdown percentage, which is not bad. And they are 16th in points per drive, which I honestly think points per drive is a metric that more people should use because it is kind of a turn-based game in some ways. However, there are a lot of other areas where they are not succeeding, we should say. They are still 4th worst in 3-and-out percentage. That's the percentage of their drives that are 3-and-outs per Arjun Menon. They are 20th in yards per play per Pro Football Reference and 26th in yards per drive. So despite that good points per drive metric, they're 26th in yards per drive. So that's kind of, in some ways, tied to the 3-and-out percentage. So it's like either they're scoring or they're doing nothing. And so that's why that yards per drive is so low. However, they are 12th in third down conversion rate per teamrankings.com. So they're kind of right in the middle of the pack there. But Dad, I think, when I look at those numbers, it's a middle-of-the-pack offense, which I think in a lot of ways, just as a whole, that was kind of what we expected going into this year, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and what you can see is that there's some things they're good at, some things they're bad at, and when you sum it all up...
And some things they're really bad at.
And when you sum it all up, they're kind of mediocre. Though some things are a little bit kind of troubling in combination, that some of their success is maybe a little bit unsustainable in terms of being like really high in red zone touchdown percentage or a lot higher in points per drive than their yards per drive would predict. So those are things, and maybe we're seeing that play out now as the offense seems to be getting worse. Maybe it's actually a little bit of regression to the mean of how many points you might expect based on their yardage success. So that's maybe going to be closer to where they end up, a little bit kind of slightly below middle of the pack as some of these other things, unless they start to see some individual improvement. And there are a lot of things kind of going on in terms of like individual players as well as the group as a whole or the coaching staff. And I didn't do a sort of deep dive on the coaching staff and scheme and things that maybe could have. But that's sort of the big picture of the offense. So we can break down passing game versus running game.
Yeah, well, let's lead into that. And I want to start with the passing game. I almost wanted to start with the running game because the running game has been so bad and the passing game has been better, I would say. But I think we should start with the passing game because, like we've said all offseason, the only thing that matters this year is Jordan Love and how he looks and getting a good evaluation of him. So, per the numbers, the passing game right now is by DVOA 11th in the NFL per FTN. They are 14th in dropback EPA, but 21st in dropback success rate per RBSDM.com. And they're currently 23rd by PFF grade in both passing and receiving. Compare that to last year. They were 8th in passing and 23rd in receiving. So the receiving is staying consistent, at least, I guess. And Dad, let's talk a little bit about Jordan Love now that we have those numbers out of the way.
The Jordan Love of it all.
The Jordan Love of it all. Because before we get into the numbers, I think, how do you think he's been playing? I'll lead it off to you. I know we did our concern meter 1 to 10 on how concerned we were. You were a 7. I was a 5, with 10 being most concerned, 1 being least concerned. I'm still at a 5. I think that he's not always being put in good situations. And to me, I would say the Raiders game was the only game I would say was bad so far. So to me, what I would say is he's had 2 good games, which I would say were the Bears game and the Atlanta game. 2 like meh games, which I would say are the Saints game, although he did lead a great comeback in that one. And the Lions game to me is like, I don't even put that on him because when you are down two starting linemen and then the other two linemen are the right guard and the right tackle are injured, like Runyon and Tom were in that game, and you can't block anyone, I don't really put that on Love that much. The Raiders game was a bad game. He played badly. He played very poorly, actually, in that game. But yeah, so I think, I did watch the quarterback school that JT O'Sullivan does on that Packers-Raiders game. It was maybe a little less bad than I initially thought when I was watching it. Still not good, though. Still a bad performance. And so I would say through 5 weeks, if you had told me to start the year before the bye that they would be 2-3, Love would have 2 good games, 2 all right games, and 1 bad game. I think if you had told me that before the year, I'd be like, okay, like first-year starter, first 5 starts, you're showing some flashes. That's pretty good. I think, like I said, where the consternation comes is that it's getting worse the last couple weeks. And I think if it had been, just like kind of steady, maybe the week 4 was one of those good games, week 2 was a bad game, etc., that would make me feel better. And, maybe if they can come out of this bye and stack a couple of successful games, I think maybe some of the nerves would go down. But, Dad, I know I had thrown it to you earlier and then yammered on about it for another, 30 seconds. But, Dad, what do you think?
Answer your question first.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think about Jordan Love? What are your thoughts right now?
So I think there are times where they have not necessarily put him in a position to succeed in terms of game plan. I mean, we've seen very little of that style of offense that seemed to be working so well in the Eagles game last year. In terms of the concepts, the how quickly he's getting the ball out and things like that, and scheming people open and spreading the ball around. One thing, though, that concerns me so far is there's some things that seem like he's having trouble with that don't show any sign of improvement, like being able to complete deep passes and his overall accuracy. Those are concerning things for a quarterback. If the efficiency is going to be so low, that's the reason why my concern meter is a little higher. I mean, there's still a chance for him to turn around, but in terms of what he's done so far, it's a little bit. I'd say it's a problem at the moment.
Yeah, the deep ball accuracy is. I was going to say the deep ball accuracy is definitely concerning. One thing I just wanted to point out is I feel like they've been less able to take advantage of the middle of the field in recent weeks. Specifically that Raiders game, I felt like they could get nothing done in the middle of the field. And it almost makes me wonder, they always say, after a few weeks, defenses have tape on you and they start to catch up. So in that game against the Raiders, they had no completions to the middle of the field in that game. And 2 of his picks were to the middle of the field.
2 picks.
So do you think that they were just sitting? Do you think the game plan coming into it for them was just take away the middle of the field and we're going to be fine? That's just something I wonder about, because it did seem like when he's had his best success, and what you said about the Eagles game. Now, I'll push back a little bit on that because I don't think the Eagles defense was fully locked in. They were playing a lot of prevent.
No, probably not.
But
I have that same question of things like the slight comeback against the Lions. Was the defense really locked in anymore by that point?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. But I guess my question is, when I was thinking about that Eagles game, I think about that crosser across the middle to Watson, obviously. Think about the hit to the middle or the hit to middle to Allen Lazard, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if, with more tape out on him, our team's going to focus on taking away that middle of the field. Because, we kind of saw last year, and it was more of by Rodgers designs, they couldn't attack the middle of the field, and they would try to attack the sidelines, but they couldn't do it efficiently. And that kind of brings us to a bit of a discussion about Jordan Love versus Rodgers last year, if you want to get into it. Or is there anything else you kind of wanted to add on to the discussion about how we feel about Love through 5 games?
Well, we can go over what some of the numbers are. And I had brought this up into our kind of what we want to do in the episode today, because something that people talked about a lot about how good the Packers could be this year in terms of their offense, and in order for the offense to be kind of good enough, Love only had to be as good as 2022 Rodgers, which was not as good as 2020 or 2021 Rodgers. And so, and then you can see like how Love stacks up against the whole league versus how, you know, maybe if we want to go into how Rodgers did against the league last year, where in some places it's kind of similar, some places it's worse.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of people were like, he just has to be as good as 2022 Rodgers. And in some ways he has been, in some ways he hasn't been. Do you want to kind of take us through that comparison of how they each
Yeah.
looked, or how Love has looked through 5 weeks versus how Rodgers looked last year?
Yeah, so we can talk about some of the numbers and where Love stacks against the league. So right now, by PFF, his passing grade is 24th in the league with a 61, which is basically like right on sort of an average grade. Last year, Rodgers was 75.9, so significantly better. His net right now, his net yards, Love's net yards per attempt are 20, 19th in the league, and he was 23rd in adjusted net yards per attempt, which includes a penalty for throwing interceptions for Pro Football Reference. So last year, Rodgers was 21st and 20th in those two metrics, so pretty much the same by net yards per attempt and adjusted net yards per attempt. His Love success rate is only 28th in the league, so he's near the bottom there. Only Fields, Tannehill, Mac Jones, Kenny Pickett, and Zach Wilson are worse. So he's pretty close to the bottom.
Not the company that you want to be in.
No, you don't. As a
neighborhood,
not really. That's not a high-priced neighborhood. You don't want to be there.
It's not a good neighborhood. And I just wanted to.
Oh, you want to throw something in there?
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to give our listeners a reminder of what success rate is. So success rate, for those of you who know, is 40% of the yards on first down, 60% or 40% of the yards to gain, that is, on first down. So if it's 1st and 10, getting 4 yards is success. 60% of the yards to gain on second down, and 100% of the yards to gain on third or fourth down. So that's what success rate is. But sorry, Dad, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so he's near the bottom of the league in success rates. And Rodgers was kind of middle of the pack last year. So that's something that Love has been substantially worse. The other thing that Love is bad at is his bad throw percentage per Pro Football Reference, 32nd in the league at 21.5%. Only Pickett for the Steelers is worse. And Rodgers was only like 15% bad throws last year. So
yeah, there are some metrics where Rodgers last year and Love are pretty close. And then there are some where there's a bit of a gap. And then there are some where there is a very large chasm. And that's this next one that we're talking about. And I think this is where a lot of the frustration and worry for Packers fans comes is on-target throw percentage and just general accuracy for Love. And if you want to say, hey, it's not fair to compare Love in his first 5 starts to Aaron Rodgers, fair. That's a fair point. It's a fair argument. But like we said earlier, I think a lot of people over the offseason were arguing, when they were arguing in favor of the Packers having a decent year this year, that, Love just had to be as good as Rodgers with a broken thumb. And so from that perspective, I think it is at least useful to view how Love is performing with how Rodgers was performing last year, with similar offensive weapons, with a similar offensive line, albeit Love's offensive line is worse, with run games that struggled at times. Hopefully the Packers' run game can bounce back this year, and it bounced back at times last year as well. But I think it is fair to look at this, and Dad, the on-target throw percentage is it's just not good, I guess is just the cleanest way of saying it. Do you want to break it down?
So it's not quite as bad as his bad throw percentage, which was 32nd, but it's still, he's 25th in the league, 7th worst. So bottom quarter of the league in his on-target percentage. And it's compared to Rodgers just last year, where he was 2nd in the league in on-target. So, and yeah, that Love has also been hurt by some drops. He's near the bottom in the league, also 25th in the league in percentage of passes that have been dropped, but that is on top of the low on-target percentage, not causing some of the incompletions. So I think, we've talked before about his completions over expected being low. And that has a couple of things. Like, okay, he's 25th in on target, he's 32nd in bad throws, and he's 25th in drops. So all those things are piling on together to have a low completion percentage.
Yeah, and where he's really struggling is, like we already said before, but deep passes. So on passes over 20 yards, Love is like at a PFF grade of 55.9, which is below average. He's slightly above average behind the line of scrimmage, short and medium. But for comparison, Rodgers last year with a very similar supporting cast had an elite PFF grade of 82.1 on passes over 20 yards. So it's tough.
And you remember going back, it's like, did we have a whole lot of YOLO balls that didn't go anywhere?
Yeah. That's kind of how I felt about it. I was like, I thought our deep passing game last year was awful. And, I guess there's room for growth. We'll say there's room for growth, I think is the fair thing to say. But, Dad, do you want to move on to... is there anything more on Love you want to say, or should we discuss some more pieces of the offense?
All right, let's go into some more pieces of the offense related to the rest of the passing game first.
Yeah, let's start with the pass blocking here, Dad. And I think, at times the pass blocking has been pretty good this year, but what do the metrics tell us about how the Packers have been doing protecting Jordan Love in the pocket?
Yeah, so it kind of depends a little bit on who you go to for your analysis. So by DVOA, they're 12th in adjusted sack rate this year. Well, last year they were 6th. We talked a little bit how the offensive line has seemed to be struggling more recently this season. But by PFF, this year they're 4th in the league in pass blocking, and last year they were 3rd. And by ESPN's pass block win rate, they are 3rd this year, and 5th last year. So slight improvement. If you look at now I think some of this might be we're looking at the average of the year, and maybe with a still relatively small number of games, only 5, that the pass blocking grade overall is being bolstered by a week 1, which had an elite grade by PFF of 85.3. In the last 4 weeks, it's been 70, 73, 60, and 75. With that 60 being against Detroit, where it was, that matches the eye test. And then if we look at sort of the individual performers for pass blocking by ESPN, Walker is 10th and Tom is 18th among tackles in pass block win rate. And then amongst interior offensive linemen, Runyon is 15th and Myers is 17th amongst all interior offensive linemen. If we also then look at the PFF grades, Bakhtiari is by far their best. In the little bit he was able to play, he had still an elite 89.9. It's like really top level play. And Walker, Tom, Runyon, and Myers have all been above average. While the left guard position, whether it's been Newman or Jenkins, has both been below average so far. Have had very similar grades. Jenkins' only good game so far this year was week 2 against Atlanta. So and then he had the knee injury. So maybe if he gets back to form, maybe that's the biggest difference between why we feel like the offensive line is not performing so well right now. Is that maybe Jenkins needs a little bit more time to round into better play after getting that MCL injury, I think it was.
Yeah, and he came back quicker than expected from that MCL injury. A lot of people, that's a 4 to 6 week injury. He came back after 3, didn't have to go on IR at all, which is, good. In some ways, though, their PFF grade by pass blocking is bolstered a lot by their performance against the Bears, which was an 85.3 grade, which is an elite grade. Last 4 weeks have been more middling, still good. 70.2, 73, 60.4 against the Lions. I think we all remember that game. And then 75 against the Raiders. I was surprised to see it that high. I thought that, Max Crosby kind of wrecked them up front at times in that game. But,
so he did more damage in the run game, I feel like, than the pass game. He had those tackles for losses and stops in the run game.
He still had a sack and a handful of pressures, though. I thought he was disruptive kind of no matter what in that game. But yeah, I think, for this offensive line and kind of how they've built the offensive line in terms of, in the past, drafting college tackles and moving them inside to guard, they're kind of building an offensive line that is designed to be better at pass blocking than run blocking. And so far, the pass blocking, I think, has been pretty good. The run blocking, which we will talk about later, has been bad, but we will save that for later. Dad, is there anything more on the offensive line pass blocking wise? Because I think the main takeaway is pass blocking has been quite good, despite having to deal with injuries at both left tackle and left guard. And I think when you consider that context put into it, and you look at like, hey, the Lions game obviously was very bad. Outside of that game, they've been pretty good at keeping Love clean. Wide receivers, on the other hand, have been a bit more up and down. Like we talked about before, they are struggling with drops right now, and there's a lot else there to talk about. There's some positives as well. But Dad, is there anything else on the offensive line you want to talk about, or do you want to move over to the receivers?
We can move over to the receivers now.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the receivers. So, there's some positives, there's some negatives. Which would you like me to start with?
Why don't you start with the positives?
Okay, so positives. I think before we talk about the receivers, we should keep in mind it's a very young unit, which we knew going in. No one is past being a second year in the league. And so that's something to keep in mind whenever you're looking at how the receivers are performing this year when we talk about some drops, that it should be viewed through the lens that they're all growing together. Now, in terms of positives, per Arjun Menon from PFF, Dontavian Wicks, rookie fifth-round pick, leads all wide receivers in frequency of getting open versus man coverage. He's the only one on the team with an above-average PFF grade versus man coverage. And the Packers really might have found something with that day 3 pick there. Remember, this was a guy who really struggled his last year in college, but his second last year in college, he would put himself on the map with his performances at Virginia that year. And, he kind of regressed a little bit that last year and kind of fell off the map for some people, fell to day 3. But a lot of people were excited about him. They're like, hey, if he could just recover that form from 2 years ago, we think he can be a really good player. And so far for the Packers, he's looked quite good at times. Some other positives, Jaden Reed, has the best quarterback rating when targeted for the team against zone at 141, which is really elite. The next is also Wicks at 82.8. So some of the young guys are succeeding. Wicks is actually doing a pretty good job being successful both against man and zone, and Reed is really killing it against zone. Now, on the other side, there are some more positives. Dobbs has a PFF grade of 70.9. I think he's looked quite good at times this year. I thought he was vastly underutilized against the Raiders, frankly, but he did have some drops in that game, so I'm not going to say it wasn't at least partially on him. There are some negatives, though. Number of targets versus man are pretty low on the team. 24 total targets versus man, 68 versus zone. Reed has the most targets at 9, but has only caught 1 of those. So Reed has struggled a bit at times against man. In terms of at the catch point, I think this one is one where the stats really line up with what you're seeing on the field. Dobbs is the only player on the team with more than 1 contested catch on the year with 4. Toure and Wicks each have 1, and then no one else has any. So I think we've seen at times.
That's the thing that's really kind of damning. They can't. Their ability to catch when there's somebody on them has been really rough,
really bad. And I think we see that. You see, at times, I thought that the second pick, obviously it was a great play by Marcus Peters. I'm talking about the second pick in the Raiders game. I was like, man, Watson, can we just work back to that a little harder, a little stronger? And at times, I think that is, play strength is something that is developed over time in the NFL, and is, I think, one of the biggest growing pains for players in the NFL is that they're just at times not strong enough. And I think the evidence that might be true is that they are struggling at contested catches this year, which has a lot to do with play strength. But I think at times it has really set up Love to kind of look worse than he has been at times. Not to necessarily make excuses for, at times, him struggling. But, yeah, so there have been some good good flashes from some of the young players. Dad, if next year they went into the year with Watson as the wide receiver 1, Dobbs as the wide receiver 2, and Reed as the slot receiver, how would you feel about that group going into next year if that was what they ran back this next year?
So is that Dobbs, Watson,
Dobbs, Watson, and Reed. I guess my main question is, how would you feel? Let me rephrase it. How would you feel if Watson was the wide receiver 1 going into next year? Because to me, I feel like he has not shown as much growth from year 1 to year 2 as I would have hoped. To be fair, he's only really played 1 game so far. I just want to put that out there. And maybe that, now that I'm thinking about it, it's not really fair for me to say that. But during that Raiders game, I feel like at times he showed a lot of the same struggles, things that he struggled with in his first year. It's like at times struggled tracking the ball. At times struggled winning in different kind of ways down the field. Slowing down coming out of his breaks, which is something Andrew Hawkins on ESPN talked about, is like when he turns back to look for the ball, he's slowing down, and some of those overthrows come from that. But Dad, what would you think if they went with Watson as the number 1 receiver next year? I know it's early, but just give me your opinion.
I think he's the best they've got in terms of talent. I think last year it wasn't, on that stretch, it wasn't just like the touchdowns and getting kind of maybe an unsustainable touchdown frequency, but he was doing well by a bunch of other metrics as well in terms of contested catch percentage and other metrics like that. He was
yards per route run was very good for him last year.
Yards per route run, right? So there was multiple advanced metrics by which he was doing very well, and so that's
true.
It wasn't. Yeah, I think that a lot of people said, "Well, he's just getting an unsustainable touchdown frequency." It's like, yeah, that's true, but that wasn't the only thing he was doing.
But yeah,
I thought there was, and so I'd feel pretty good about it, unless of course going to get Marvin Harrison Jr. That might change my tune about him being number 1 receiver. But I think he's got the ability to be a star. I think he's got to show a little bit more consistency, a little more toughness at the catch. Though he was getting contested catches at a decent rate last year, so I think part of it is just getting his feet under him. He's had this bad luck of interrupting his development with these injuries. So that's, I think, the big thing is, can he stay healthy?
Yeah, I think that's maybe more of a fair question.
Maybe the biggest knock.
He has only played that 1 game. It is premature to talk about. I guess it is premature to talk about who is the number 1 receiver going into next year. That's fair. But Dad, while we're talking about pass catchers, let's move on to the tight ends. Now, you were saying that you feel like this group needs a veteran presence. I don't know that I agree.
Okay.
I almost think let him sink or swim. So we all know Musgrave's taken the majority of snaps. I don't count DeGuara as a tight end. He's a fullback at this point. Then Kraft has taken the next most, and then Sims has taken the next most. Kraft has had the worst PFF grade overall at 41.9, which is really bad. But he's graded out well as a pass blocker. He's actually the best graded pass blocker, but only on 7 snaps. Musgrave has the deepest ADOT of all of them by a lot at 7.3. Although him and DeGuara actually end up, although DeGuara's is down at 2.7, they actually end up with similar yards per reception, which I think is kind of funny. I would not mind seeing more Sims. I feel like Sims has looked better blocking than Kraft. And if the argument is like, hey, we want to have Kraft get all these snaps so he can develop, fair enough. But I personally, through 5 games, I've felt like the very small amount of snaps that we've seen of Sims have looked pretty good at times. And he looked promising, I feel like, and maybe more ready to play right now than Kraft. What do you feel about the tight end position?
I mean, he had some nice bursts on that catch in the last game.
Maybe I'm just right I could just be getting, kind of
you're like
ooh, shiny. Like that one play. That one play was pretty cool.
You got too much hopium from that one play.
I mean, he looked good in that one play. That's all I'm going to say.
When I say I'd like a veteran presence, what I mean by that is I would like a pass blocking tight end veteran. I think they're generally not quite good enough, or maybe some of it is I'm just burned by how they tried to do some blocking by the tight ends in the last game. So that's where, that's a combination of coaching decisions plus pass blocking, where it's actually not only detrimental to figure out how good the tight ends are, but the rest of the offense as well.
Yeah. And I don't know. I don't see it as big of a need. I feel like the offensive line has pass blocked well enough, like where they don't need a dedicated pass blocking tight end. To me, it's like, I think just put your tight ends in better positions. Don't have Kraft coming across the formation to block Crosby. Don't try and double team Crosby with 2 tight ends. Like, let's just have them do things that they're capable of. That's
like
kind of
that
my
play,
thought on
especially when they have like a tight end and then another tight end trying to block Crosby. Why did they put a 6th offensive lineman over there for that play? Now, it wasn't going to work when you're trying to get somebody to go all the way across the formation. If you put a lineman there, he's not going to be going any faster than Kraft. That whole decision is just mind-boggling.
That whole game was mind-boggling. Let's not dwell on it too much. But yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot to talk about for the tight ends for me coming out of the bye week. I feel like, Musgrave has looked good at times. I don't think he's looked like out of this world or anything. I think he still looks like a baby deer at times, like getting his feet under him. And that was kind of one of my concerns coming out of college is he can't stay. And the problem, I think, actually is like, I was concerned about his yak coming out of college staying upright. At times, I feel like in his routes, he's not staying upright. Like he's falling over running routes, which is not good. That's like the actual, like, okay, that's concerning because
that was like he's like so wide open. He fell down before he caught that one play on
against the Bears.
The fumbled.
The fumbled tight end leak. Yeah, but that's kind of all I really have to say about that, as Forrest Gump would say. But let's move on to, Dad, the running game. It's been bad, but it's also by statistics, it's been better than you'd think. So
overall, it depends on what statistic you use.
Yes, it depends on what statistic you use. So I would say, to me, DVOA lines up better with how I feel about it. So overall, they are 27th in rush DVOA per FTN, which kind of takes into account the strength of your opponent, et cetera, et cetera. But surprisingly, they are 14th in rush EPA and 15th in rushing success rate per RBSDM.com. It's surprising to me that those numbers are as high as they are, that they're middle of the pack. I would have guessed they were way closer to dead last than that. But I think there's some interesting things going, because I think no matter what those numbers are saying, I would say that the Packers' run game has been disappointing. I think we can at least say the Packers' run game has been disappointing and has not been. They have needed it to be better than it's been. I think schematically there are some interesting things going on here. So, to me, I would argue, and there are some statistics that would say that last year they were actually a decent running game. I felt like last year they did not run the ball as well as they had 2 years ago, or at least didn't block the run as well as they had 2 years ago. These are per PFF. 2 years ago, they ran 280 zone running plays and 125 power running plays. That's a ratio of 2.24 to 1, so over 2 times as many zone as power. Last year, they ran 261 zone to 148 power, which is 1.8 to 1. This year, they've run 50 zone and 47 power, which is pretty much 1 to 1. So this is something that has actually been happening around the league amongst Shanahan's systems. A lot of both Kyle Shanahan and I think Sean McVay as well I was listening to a podcast about this, have leaned into doing more pin pull stuff and more variety in their running games. But I almost feel like the Packers have kind of, it seems like as they've leaned more into power, the run offense has gotten worse. And I know we talked about the last podcast how they haven't been able to get anything going outside the numbers running the football. I wonder just, maybe a little more inside zone for the Packers going forward could maybe help them. And obviously the coaches know a million things more than me, know more than I'll ever even, they've forgotten more than I'll ever even know about football. But I think that this trend of leaning more into power has kind of at least coincided, and obviously that doesn't necessarily prove causation, with being less efficient as a run game. And so I think schematically that is at least something that I'm keeping my eye on. Dad, run blocking wise, I mean, it's all bad any which way you want to look at it. Do you want to break it down? Because it's just bad. It's bad.
Yeah, we could take 3 different ways and 3 different sites that have measured run blocking performance or efficiency. So by PFF, they're 26th in the league in run blocking this year. By ESPN, run block win rate, they're 29th. And per DVOA from FTN Fantasy, they are 27th in adjusted line yards. So if you compare that to last year, so by PFF's run blocking grade last year, they were 23rd. ESPN had them 8th last year. And by DVOA, they were second in adjusted line yards. So some big drop offs and being really bad.
Yeah. And I
PFF,
didn't particularly, I felt like the run blocking, I mean, PFF didn't think the run blocking was good. Some places did. I personally, my opinions on this here, at least, align with PFF's that I thought they didn't block the run very well much at all last year either. And I think at times they were kind of, I was just going to say at times I thought they were being bailed out by Aaron Jones. And Aaron Jones hasn't been healthy this year. He's barely played a game. And I think Dillon has been disappointing, to say the least.
Yeah, I think this last game, actually, for Dillon, he had his best game. They ran him up the middle a little bit more, I think, strategically, in terms of his play. It's maybe playing to his strengths a little bit more. But if you also look at this, so that talked about the offensive line as a whole. If you look at the individuals, so per ESPN, there's not a single lineman in the top 10 for run block win rate. No centers, guards, or tackles. Last year, they did have Nyman, they had first among all offensive tackles in run block win rate. And he can't get on the field this year.
Yeah, I'm still surprised by that. I'm surprised they haven't at least thought about putting him in for Walker, because I think Walker had a better preseason. I mean, we said this a million times. Walker had a better preseason. I think Nyman's been better actually in NFL games in the past, and Nyman's a better run blocker. At least that's how I'm surprised they haven't at least thought about it, or at least looked at it. And maybe they have and still decided to roll with Walker. But, I mean, there is the added bit of context that Nyman is a free agent after this year, and Walker is under contract. So there's that as well. Yeah. Maybe they're just like, hey, we want Walker to get the reps because we're building for next year, because that was something we talked about going into the years. A lot of what they are doing this year is looking for next year.
Yeah, and by PFF, the run blocking grades, only Tom is having what you call a good year, 75.7 grade, and Bakhtiari is a little bit above average as well, and the rest are actually below average. So that's not good.
Yeah, and do you want to move on to Dillon, because I mean he's having
let's talk about Dillon. He's having
a tough year. He was better against the Raiders. Mostly just that one drive, though, I would say. He's having and the first drive of the game and the one touchdown drive with the short field. But he's having his worst year so far in a contract year. Overall offense, pass blocking, running, it's by a lot. His receiving is also not great, but that's more around average for his career. But I feel like they're also just not throwing him the ball much.
Much less than the last 2 years.
Much less than 2 years ago, especially, at least when I would say 2 years ago was his best year. And then the past 2 years have just been...
his best receiving was 2 years ago.
I would say just best year overall. I mean, I just think back to like that year, 2021, I was like, wow, he's running it better than Jones this year. And I haven't said that since. It just hasn't been good enough. And he's averaging barely 3 yards a carry. He's not contributing much to the offense. They're not able to stay on schedule. And it's not all his fault. It's because, and a lot of times it's because I think he needs good run blocking. But at the same time, it's like if you're a running back who needs good run blocking, like there are a lot of other guys who can do that job. And so unfortunately, I think, maybe we might be looking at, if you can't turn it around, this might end up being the last year of Dillon in Green Bay, unfortunately, which is tough because he is a big fan favorite and he seems to really love living in Wisconsin, which is always awesome when you have a Packers player who's psyched to be here. Anything you wanted to add on that one? It's not great.
No, that pretty much sums it up what we had for the running back. And Jones, in terms of looking at the running backs overall, just hasn't played enough to with only 14 carries and 3 receptions so far this year to
he hasn't even played a full game overall. He hasn't even played a full game's worth of snaps. I mean, it just is what it is. And hamstring injuries are always tricky. And I think there are going to be some. That's the fact that he's been hurt so much this year so far also means that the conversations around him this offseason are going to be complicated as well. But that kind of does it for the offense. Dad, do you want to move on to talking about how we feel about the defense through the bye week? I have some numbers here. I think, honestly, let's talk a little bit about our overall impressions. I think the defense has been fine. I think the defense has been fine except for the Lions game and the very end of the Falcons game. I think for a lot of the Falcons game, they were okay. I mean, they did get it kind of run down their throat as the game went on. But, you know, they stomped down the Bears. They shut out the Saints for a lot of that game. And they did enough to win the game against the Raiders. So if you just go based on defensive performance, I would say they should have 3 wins. Overall, a lot of the statistics are middling. But Dad, how do you feel about the defense through those 5 games?
So I think if you look at it on the whole, though, it's like, okay, they've been good enough from the aggregate, but you always feel like there are a couple of just head-scratching plays, you know, or you know, infuriating plays. Like, well, why did you even do it that way? That you're setting yourself up to fail, and that's, I think, what people are most when people are, you know, want to keep the torches and pitchforks out. It's because of these few plays that just don't make sense.
Yeah, but I
there is, I would say that overall they've been kind of middle of the pack as a defense.
Yeah,
when you sum it all together.
The metrics kind of bear that out. I mean, they're 11th in yards per play. They're 7th best in third down conversion rate, but they're dead last in fourth down conversion rate. 17th in yards per drive, 14th in points per drive, 21st in team defense DVOA per FTN. They're 20th in EPA per play, but 25th in success rate per RBSDM.com. And to me, those last two, that EPA per play and success rate, is they're not allowing too many big plays, or not allowing as many big plays as they are allowing, just like kind of getting cut up down the field, it feels like. But yeah, they're a middling defense right now.
And for the critics, you know, to be fair to the critics, that has been kind of the issue, is like you just let the team slowly march down the field on these long extended drives.
Yeah, the dead last in fourth down conversion rate 100% tracks also. Like I saw that and I was like, yeah, that makes sense. I feel like I'm surprised they've stopped a fourth down, to be honest. I can't remember off the top of my head us stopping a fourth down. It's not 100%? Are we sure? Can we double check that? But yeah, the defense has been, in my opinion, fine. And a lot of people would say, oh, you got a lot of talent on the defense, it should be better. I would say that was a fair argument last year. I don't know that is the defense that talented this year? I mean, yes, in some ways. I mean, you have Rashawn Gary, but he's still kind of on a pitch count. You have
I have a question for you.
Okay.
About the talent. So I have an idea of who I had somebody in my head for this. Who would you say has been the second best player on defense so far this year?
If you're saying the first best has been Gary?
Yes, for sure.
I think the second best has been Kenny. I think it's a pretty clear second. Now, if you ask me who the third would be,
you know who I have?
Well, if you ask me who third would be, I would say Preston Smith.
I have Rasul.
Really? That's interesting. I think, you know, the Lions game left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth, where he struggled in that one. You know, gave up the big play to Laporta earlier, got burned on the Amon-Ra St. Brown one.
This is true.
Yeah. So that's why I would say...
Maybe I'm feeling a little bit too good about his most recent game against the Raiders.
Yeah. But I would say, Kenny's been second for me. I would argue Preston might be third. Rudy Ford is asleep.
If you don't take him too much for his coverage.
Yeah, well, I don't.
But like, Rudy... Why even bother giving that much weight to his coverage?
Yeah, and I think Rudy Ford's had a really nice season through 5 games.
Yeah.
Like, much better than I would have expected. But, Dad, since we're talking a little bit about coverage, let's talk about the pass defense specifically and do a bit of a deep dive into how that's looked so far this year. So, overall, they're 14th in pass DVOA per FTN. They're 12th in dropback EPA, but they're 24th in dropback success rate. And that kind of, ties into they're not giving up a ton of big plays, but they're kind of letting you march it down the field a little bit. In terms of pass rush, they're 24th by PFF this year. Last year, they were 15th. They're 15th in ESPN pass rush win rate, though. Last year, they were 12th, but they did drop off dramatically once Gary got hurt. They don't have anybody in the ESPN top 10 for their position at that metric right now. And then per DVOA, they're 15th in adjusted sack rate on defense. Last year, they're 17th. To me, I'm not worried about the pass rush until Gary is back full time, because Gary has an elite PFF pass rush grade of 89.9. No other edge for the Packers is above average right now by PFF. But the fact that Gary has been such a wrecking ball in his small number of snaps leads me to believe that once they get him back in a full-time role, I think the pass rush will kind of sort itself out. And Wyatt's actually also been really good in terms of on true pass sets, on true pass set pass rushing. He's had an elite grade per PFF of 81.2. Gary's win rate is crazy. It's 28%, which is third amongst all edges. No one else for the Packers is in the top 100, but we're not going to worry about that. And then Wyatt's at 10.8%, or pressure percent, which is second amongst interior D linemen. Wooden is 28th amongst interior D linemen, Clark is 33rd, and Brooks is 40th. I would say I'm not that worried, like I said, about the pass rush. How are you feeling about the pass rush so far? I think it's been fine. I honestly wish I had seen a little more from Wyatt. These numbers are higher than I would have expected from just watching him. I feel like, second-year first-round pick who's 25 years old, he's a little on the older side. You'd have maybe expected him to be a little more dominant this year. But, by the numbers, he's had a pretty nice year. I think maybe some of it's the up-and-down nature. I think that he was really good against Chicago. He was pretty good against the Lions. And then had, I think, a worse game against the Falcons, if I remember correctly. But, Dad, pass rush-wise, how are you feeling about this team?
I feel like pass rush-wise is one of the better aspects of their defense, even though they're not getting enough contribution across the board. But they've got better pass rush from their D linemen than they've, I think, had in a long time. And Gary is could potentially be one of good enough as a star to kind of carry the unit amongst the edge rushers.
Yeah, 100% agree. But we know for pass defense, it's always a tandem between pass rush and coverage. The coverage has been decent. And I'm interested to see what happens when Stokes comes back. Joe Barry said in his presser the other day that, having to find a way to work Stokes in is a champagne problem, he said. It's a good problem to have. Overall, they're 9th by PFF this year in coverage. Last year, they were 14th. Rasul, by PFF, is playing really well. He's 5th overall in the league in coverage grade amongst corners with more than 10 snaps. Jair's having a bit of a down year, though, Dad. And I think part of that is he's been a little dinged up. He was dinged up in preseason as well, if you remember. I wonder if maybe he's just not quite 100% healthy. His coverage grade is just a 66.3, which is just barely better than Corey Ballantyne. He's given up a near perfect 155.8 rating at times when targeted. He was really good week 1. He was really bad week 2. And week 5 was also not great. And I think that's had a bad back. And he was dealing with, if I remember correctly, it was some kind of lower body issue during preseason, if I remember correctly. Amongst the safeties, I actually feel like the safeties are doing way better than I expected. Rudy Ford is doing really well. He's 20th amongst safeties in coverage grade per PFF at 74. Savage is doing worse, but I think Savage is still playing better than he did last year, I guess is how I feel about that. Dad, how do you feel about the safeties? Because I think going into this was the weakest position on the roster on paper. But they've been way better than I think anyone expected. I think Ford especially. And especially considering the fact that in the offseason, Ford was the one whose job was up for grabs, where, they were putting Owens out there, they were putting Tarvarius Moore out there, and they had Ford initially, and then they went away from him, and they came back to him, and I think he's kind of rewarded their faith a little bit.
Yeah, I remember at some point it was like, why did they... And I remember feeling like it was taking too long to try somebody instead of Ford, but now Ford's been their best safety. And I think myself and maybe a lot of other people thought this could be the worst safety group in the league. And I don't think that's actually true. And I think a large part of that is because Ford has overperformed expectations.
By a lot. I think he's overperforming by a lot.
By a lot, right. I think people thought he might be more like one of the worst safeties in the league instead of being in the top 20.
Yeah, we're talking about a guy who's more of a career special teamer, and you could argue he's been a top 5 player on the defense. He's one of their better playmakers. He has 2 interceptions so far this year. I think it's fair to say he's maybe the most, surprising, like positively surprising, we'll say, player on the team so far.
Yeah.
But, Dad, anything else you wanted to say about the pass defense, or should we move on to the run defense? Because I think that's where, as always, good old Green Bay just can't quite seem to do much there.
Yeah, it's been we were talking about how long you felt it's been since you had a good running game or run blocking. It's been even longer since you had a good run defense.
It's been a lot longer since we've had a good run defense. Let's talk about it a little bit. Per PFF, run defense is 18th in the league. Last year they were 26th. Per ESPN run stop win rate, 19th. Last year they were 31st. So they have gotten better. Slayton and Enagbare are both top 10 in their positions in run stop win rate per ESPN.
As in 10th.
Yeah.
Top 10 by being 10th.
Hey, still top 10. Per DVOA, they're 25th in adjusted line yards, 25th in second level yards, but they're first in open field yards on defense, which is yards more than 10 yards downfield per carry. Last year, they were dead last in adjusted line yards, 30th in second level, and 19th in open field.
Right. So
this year, though,
those aspects of like that they're getting better at, that's like safety and linebacker work. Like that, not letting him run wild in a second and third level of the field as much as they did last year.
Yeah, although some other advanced statistics, they're still 27th in rush EPA this year, which is bad, and they're 25th in rush success rate. So also bad. Dad, position group wise, how does this kind of break down? How would you divvy it up? Let's kind of start with the edge rushers, maybe.
Yeah. So far for the edge rushers in terms of run defense, only Preston Smith and Hollins are above average by PFF.
Preston
All the
is
rest are
carrying
below average.
Preston is carrying the entire edge setting on his back right now. He's the only one who is like consistently setting an edge, and I think Gary's done okay at it at times, but other times has kind of lost the plot there.
He just abandons it. I mean,
Sometimes.
The problem is
I
think that's why his grade is low. Is sometimes he just gets so dedicated to diving inside against the quarterback that he gives up the edge.
Yeah,
and they run around behind him.
And then the other is, I think LVN has looked good against the run as well. He just hasn't had a very high complement of snaps. And I think even
I think he has some potential there.
Yeah, and the edge rusher coach, I think it's Rebrich, mentioned that he really liked the physicality that Van Ness was bringing in the run game, and he actually said, like, we just need him to bring that physicality in the pass game now. But yeah, amongst the front though, only, like you said, Preston and Hollins are above average, and only Slayton is above average for defensive line, which I feel like is a bit surprising. I'm surprised Kenny's not up there, but it does kind of track for the rest of them in terms of how they've built this D-line out, Dad.
Yeah, when you look at just the missed tackle percentage on the team overall, the three worst are three defensive linemen. Wyatt, Wooden, and Brooks all have missed tackle percentages in the low 20s. Slayton is at 7%, and Kenny doesn't have a single missed tackle yet this year. Overall, Wyatt is by far the worst in missed tackle percentage, at 37%, 37.5. So that's not necessarily only missed tackles in the run game. This where they're the worst. And so if you include the passing game as well as the run game, then Wyatt's missed tackle percentage is by far the worst of the team. When you look now getting into the second, third levels of the defense, Rasul is by far the best cornerback against the run game, which kind of tracks. He's bigger corner than most of the other ones on the team, and has done a good job of sniffing out some plays. And both Ford and Savage have been above average at safety against the run among safeties. So something that I don't think anybody could have predicted based on last year's performance from Savage, for example. He's actually been a little better against the run this year than against the pass.
Yeah, and then going on for second level, Campbell has not played much. And he is above average against the run while Walker's below average, and there's a big drop from Campbell to McDuffie. How much of their poor performance would you say is missing Campbell? He's still projected to miss a little bit more time. He's not back practicing yet. Do you think if they had Campbell, they would be a better run defense, I guess is what I'm thinking. How much of it would you chalk up to that injury?
It might be a decent amount, though. One thing. So even though Campbell's overall run grade is pretty good, his depth of tackle is not so good. It's pretty deep actually. While Walker's been better in that regard.
But that
Maybe
kind
some,
of makes
maybe,
me that does make me think though that it is kind of on the defensive line. To me, like, I don't know, I've ranted and raved about this, but Jerry Montgomery has been the D-line coach across 3 coordinators now. He's been the run game coordinator on defense. I feel like the defensive line is consistently the position group that is at fault for not playing the run well, at fault for underperforming. They have talent along that D-line now. They have not really developed any of the players that they've drafted there besides Kenny.
The other thing that kind of matches the eye test and why you feel like whatever they're doing with
no one on
defense,
this team can get off a block. Like that's any position. No one on this team can get off a block.
But the other thing that this kind of matches with in terms of the defensive line standing up in the run game is their ability to like stop a team at like 4th and 1 or down at the goal line in a run play.
Yeah, we saw they have the worst 4th down conversion rate allowed in the league, 80%. Yeah. And I off the top of my head, it feels like all of those have just been short runs, which kind of tracks. But
they just get pushed back in the run in those power situations.
They don't play with much force up front, and some of it's personnel. Wooden's a smaller pass rushing type guy. Brooks was an edge rusher in college. He's still coming along. But you would hope that like a bigger first rounder in Wyatt, you've got Slayton, who's like your nose tackle, like classic run stuffing nose tackle. You got Kenny, who's like, all around can do everything. You have a star there. You have some talent there. And so I feel like that position group against the run has underperformed for years now. And really in general, I think has underperformed for years now. But that was just kind of a tangent brought on about your talk about depth of tackle. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about? I see that you said Ford has no missed tackles on the year. Another feather in my cap for putting him as a top 5 defensive player on the team this year. Do you think that's outlandish? Is that crazy to say?
Oh, for Ford?
Yeah, to say Ford's been a top 5 defensive player on the team?
I don't think that's crazy.
Yeah, he's been way better than anyone has anything. Yeah. But, run game overall, we're not reinventing the wheel here. The run defense is bad. It has been bad. I don't know how it gets better because, maybe they've tried things is the thing. They've tried having more down linemen. They've tried playing 3 linebackers. I know Matt LaFleur has said, like, we can't just keep doing the same thing. We need to do things differently or we're insane. He said that before, though. Like, I just don't know. I don't know what you can do to fix this run defense without just players playing better at times.
Yeah, but you do wonder what the story is when the overall performance doesn't change regardless of who you put in there.
Yeah.
Then where do you look? Right?
Yeah,
Who's in
and
charge?
it's like at this point, it's like at times I'm like, is it coaching? Is it personnel? Like Maybe
it's not coaching in the sense of scheme or plan, but
individual development. And that's why I have my eyes on Jerry Montgomery at times where I'm like, what exactly is it you would say you do here? But that's another conversation for another time. We have gotten a little long here breaking down the bye week. This is supposed to be just a nice little nugget episode, but there's a lot to talk about.
It was a good amount to talk about. It was a 20-pack of nuggets.
Yes. Hey, that could still be a snack. But anyway, this kind of does it for our bye week wrap up. Thank you so much for listening. We hope that things kind of turn around after this bye week with the matchup against the Broncos. We will be doing a preview for that game later this week. We'll have it out to you. So don't worry, that episode is still coming, and we'll be doing a post-game after that. Rest of the year, going through the rest of the season, we'll be doing 2 episodes a week, pregame, postgame for every game, hopefully into the playoffs. That feels like wishful thinking right now, but you never know. Maybe they'll turn it around. And then during the
magic of the bye week, everything's going to be fixed with the extra week of preparation.
Yes, that's true. I every time I get a little too excited, it's like, oh, they're gonna fix all this stuff over the bye week. I have to they lost to the Raiders. Calm down. But anyway, no disrespect, Raiders. You beat us fair and square. We suck. But anyway,
unfortunately, you have to say we lost to the Raiders fair and square. That's the part that hurts the most. It's not like they got punt return touchdown or a block kick touchdown and put up a bunch
Nope.
of fluke plays. It's like, nope, they just outplayed us.
Just got beat by the Raiders, who are not good. But apparently neither are we. So maybe we'll turn it around. We're playing the Broncos this week. You never know. But anyway,
Who
like
are
I
even
said,
worse than the Raiders. So
yeah,
fingers crossed.
I'm not saying anything because I remember in our pregame last week I said I don't see how they lose this game. We found out.
We found out.
We did find out.
We just gotta stretch that imagination a little bit more.
Yeah, be a little more creative. But anyway, like I said, thank you so much for listening. If you like what you hear, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. Come subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice. If you like what you hear here today, come give us a follow on Twitter. Well, I already said that. Oh well, we'll cut that in post. Don't
you can
worry.
Follow us on Twitter more than once.
Yeah, why not? Make another account. Follow us again. We'll take it. But anyway, thank you so much for listening. Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts. Put all our episodes out on YouTube as well. Oh, Dad, I realize. Special teams. Anders Carlson looking good. Daniel Whelan looking less good. Punt coverage, not up to snuff for having so many special teams guys on the roster. Thoughts? Anything else on the special teams you want to throw out before we, throw to break, so to speak?
I was just saying that Carlson's been turning out to be more of a gamer, I guess.
Knock on wood.
When it's we were all worried about how poorly he was performing in practices in training camp, but the games and preseason games and regular season games, he's been good.
We're talking about practice.
Talking about practice, right?
Talking about practice. But anyway, like we said, thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you on the next one. This has been our bye week breakdown, and until next time, go Pack Go.
Go Pack Go.